Chaisa avoda b'mishkan u'mikdash, ba'avodas habirurim t'bechinas iskafia. Hamevi u'mayla l'bechinas ishapcha, chashucha l'nehora. So all this service, basically, of subjugation and transformation, this was the avoda in the Mishkan and the Mikdash, what we call the avodas habirurim. What does it mean, the avodas habirurim?
The sifting of the spark.
Sifting? Okay, yeah, like the refining, right? When you take something and do a birur, you basically separate the good from the bad, right? And so the idea of all what we do in the world is essentially, when we take an object and we have iskafia with it, we're essentially saying, like, this aspect of creation, I have to say, is untouchable, right? And only integrate the good. So that's called the process of birurim, and that's what elicits the sovev light, as we were saying. So this is the essential act of the Mishkan and the Mikdash. It was the avodas habirurim with hiskafia leading to his hapcha, transformation of darkness to light. Therefore, achas avodas shayva mikdash u'inin avodas hakarbanos. And therefore, one of the services of the temple was the service of the karbanos, right? Shu avoda ruchni shebenefesh. This is like, for those who, I'm not sure what our crowd is over here, but many have questions about basically animal sacrifices. Like, it sounds like a weird, ancient and backward practice in the eyes of many in the world. And we're saying that we're doubling down. In other words, when the Mikdash is going to be built, we're going to go back and do it again. We got our Kohanim ready, took up some meat. So what's the story? What does this deal with these animal sacrifices, right? So he says, this is exactly what we're dealing with, because the whole idea is hiskafi and hishapcha, subjugation and transformation. Therefore, one of the actions of the temple was the sacrifices, which really was a spiritual action in the soul, right? That zeu inyan hishtatfus hakonim v'levim b'avodasam v'shiram v'zimram beis havas hakarban. I see, this is why you asked me the difference between shira and zimra. Gotcha. So he says, in other words, what he wants to say is this is not just a physical act. If it was, it wouldn't have to be accompanied by priests and high priests and singing and instruments. In other words, the fact that there was this whole like spiritual element taking place, that they were mamash praising Hashem in this very spiritual way, all the while like sort of hacking away at this animal, shows you that this was not just a physical act. It's something spiritual in the soul, right? So if you're going to be singing and dancing, so to speak, and playing instruments, then obviously there's some kind of a spiritual endeavor. So what's the spirituality of sacrificing an animal? And additionally, we're going to say, right, that it says, make me a temple, I'll dwell within them. And we spoke about the idea that we are also the temple, right? It's not just that there's a building and we do the service over there, where it says I dwell within them, right? That Hashem is going to dwell within us, that all the actions and the sacrifices that took place in the temple are really something that takes place in the spiritual life of every Jew. And that's also why there was song and Levim and Kohanim, because it was to indicate that this is not just a physical practice, it's a spiritual practice which relates to every single one of us. Yes, Daniel.
When we bring the korban of the animal, I can understand it from a first and second temple perspective. In a way, it's like we're kind of sacrificing the Behema part of our neshama. In a sense, it's a tikkun for that. But I don't understand why you said we're going to continue that in the third temple,
right? But
then at the same time, I'm pretty sure I remember it says that after the Geula, our Yetzer Hara will be slaughtered. So then what is the point of bringing a korban if we no longer have a Yetzer Hara and therefore no longer we do errors?
Because the idea is basically, first of all, it seems that the temple will come back before the time which is called Tchias HaMesim. Right? There's two periods of Mashiach's coming. It's called Yemos HaMashiach and Tchias HaMesim. And they're not necessarily at the same time. But the idea is that when the temple is built, there's actually stages, right? So it says when the temple is built, Mashiach is going to come, he's going to fight the wars of Hashem, build the temple, and then gather the exiles. So I just saw actually yesterday in a Sikha, I saw it before in life, but someone challenged me on it, so I saw it again to reinforce it in my mind, that the Rebbe says it's a process. He's going to first fight the wars of Hashem, then he's going to build the temple, and later, like as a third thing, he's going to gather the exiles, which means that the temple is going to be built in full before all the exiles are gathered. So in other words, even the Geula hasn't even been completed yet, and even we can't even call this person certainly Mashiach yet, even after the temple's already been built, right? Because there's still a stage left in order to get to the point where you can say this is definitely Mashiach. Because the definite Mashiach comes with three conditions. He fights the words of Hashem, builds the temple, and gathers the exiles. So the building of the temple will happen before he gathers the exiles. That means that there's a temple in the world, and there's a guy that just built it, and we still can't call him Mashiach. But what we will be doing is using the temple, which means even before like all the end of day, magic is going on, seemingly the temple will be in use. Yeah.
The calves, the red heifer calves that exist in this day and age are not like they have to be 3 years old or something like that, and they're about 1.5 years old. There's a bunch of red heifer calves.
Okay, Bezrat Hashem will use them. If not, we'll find some more.
No, but there's certain requirements to
Right, I understand. They find them like every couple of years.
Yeah, but the ones that are for now, for most recent, they'll be ready for use in like about 1.5 years or
Okay.
so. Which that's like a good trajectory for potentiality.
Okay. Anyway, maybe we'll find one that's already ready to go tomorrow. You never know. I guess it has to be overseen. Yeah, today. All right, let's continue. So what we're saying is that the sacrifices are a spiritual aspect of the soul. And he says that this is actually written into the Torah in such a way. Shimon, do you want a copy, or do you want to just hang out and teach another class over there on the side? All right. So what we're talking about is that the sacrifice is spiritual. We see that from the Levim and the singing and so forth. And he says that it's also something which is related to the soul of every person. And where do we see that? Because it says, right, this is based on a famous mimer from the Alter Rebbe, which is entitled this, Adam ki yakriv mikem karban la'Hashem. This is the pasuk which tells us about the sacrifices, right? And it says, a man, when he will offer from amongst you, karban la'Hashem, a sacrifice to Hashem, and then it goes on and tells you what the rules are. Mina behema, mina baka, mina tzon, right? It should either come from the animals or the flock, or the cattle or the flock, right? And it goes into details from that point on what if it's a behema or if it's a tzon, what the different rules are. So the Alter Rebbe asks, and he brings down here, l'chora, seemingly yuksha. We have a question. If the intention in this verse was rak levaer mishpatei hakarbon, was only to tell us the rules of a sacrifice. In other words, just the blood and guts, excuse the pun there, but rules of what the actual offering required according to halacha. If that was the mere intention in this verse, remember, we're trying to say that the whole thing is a spiritual activity. It's not just a physical act. So, and we're trying to say that is actually written into the Torah. Hashem is indicating that this has all to do with spirituality, and it's something that affects every Jew. So he says, if it was merely talking about the physical act of a carbon, right, then it should have said, Have leila lemar. It should have said, Adam mikem ki yakriv carbon l'Hashem. What's the difference besides Moshe, who I've gone over this with a few times? What did he just ask? What's the difference between what it says and what he just suggested? In the verse, go back and look. It says "kedekasiv." See that? You gotta open your eyes. You read. What does it say? What's the difference between what it actually says and what he's suggesting it should say?
Me?
Anybody? Just trying to get you guys a little bit involved over here. Second line from the bottom of the first page, it says "kedekasiv." And this is the verse, the actual verse in the Torah. Adam ki yakriv miken karban la'Hashem mina behem mina bakar mina tzon. Right, that's what it says in the Torah, and we translate it as this: a person, when he will offer from amongst you a sacrifice to Hashem, it should be from an animal, etc. If it was only trying to explain the simple laws of the carbon, it should have said what? Adam became ki yakriv karban l'Hashem. What's the difference? Can you spot it? Rabbi Yaakov. One word is different. I'll just give you a clue. Where's your thing? All right, I'm going to have to give it away. You guys are a little bit slow this morning. It's a fast day. You didn't have your coffee. All right, so he says like this.
Is the word swapped around?
The word is swapped around. Which word is swapped around?
Kiabron and ki.
Ki yakriv,
Yeah,
right?
Yakariv, yeah.
Is said in the actual verse. It says Adam ki yakriv, but he wants to imply that it should say Adam mikem ki yakriv.
Yeah.
What it over says over here is Adam ki yakriv mikem, right? Where what it should say, he says, seemingly, if you want to just kind of explain this in a simple sense, that it's talking about a person offering a sacrifice, it should say Adam mikem ki yakriv. What's the difference linguistically? What is the difference? What is the difference in the translation of those two things? Very similar, but slightly different. Even in English, it
The structure.
you can
of the
understand it.
sentence
The structure of the sentence is like off the way it's written in the actual Torah. Because here's how you would say it. You should say a person from amongst you. When you will offer a sacrifice, it should be X, Y, and Z. So you would say Adam mikem, a person from amongst you, ki yakriv, when he will offer such and such. What does it actually say? It says Adam ki yakriv, a person when he offers mikem, from amongst you. It's just a weird, like uncomfortable way of saying that, right? You don't say a person when he offers from amongst you. You would say a person from amongst you when he offers. So the fact the Rebbe wants to point out here, the fact that little word is switched around and it's such a glaring, sort of strange way of speaking in English, in ancient Hebrew, and everything else. He says it's coming to teach you a lesson. And the lesson is that the sacrifices are not merely about blood and guts, right? It's something spiritual, and it's sunk into the verse based on this word switch, okay? And if it was going to just be a simple action of telling you the laws, it should say like this: Adam mikem, a person from amongst you, ki yakriv karban l'Hashem. When he will offer a carbon to Hashem, hine kach v'kach yeh mishpat huvas carbon. So such and such will be the laws of bringing the carbon v'hilchosav, and its laws. And that's what he says here: from the animal, from the flock, from the cattle. Ma omer Adam ki yakriv mikem. And the question is, why does it say Adam ki yakriv mikem and put the mikem after the words ki yakriv? So it's known the intention behind this. Why is it known? Because the Alter Rebbe has a mimer about this. Sheba hu gam levaer klalus inin hakarbonos ba'avodas nefesh hadam. Because it's actually coming to tell you something which is generationally significant. It's not only coming to tell you about the time when there was a temple, right? It's also coming to tell you about the time when there is no temple, and even the times when there was a temple. It's coming to tell you the true inner meaning of the sacrifice, that it's a spiritual avoda. In other words, why are we offering an animal? It's a little bit strange, to be honest with you. So he says, this is what it means, Adam ki yakriv. A man, ki yakriv, let's break down the sentence. It means Adam kasher yiskarev le'elokus. The first and foremost, it's of interest and noteworthy to say that the word for a sacrifice means to come close. That's actually how we say sacrifice in Hebrew. And not necessarily is the only way to say sacrifice, right? You could say hiskafia. Hiskafia also means to sort of subdue yourself. But when it comes to the karbonos, why is it called a carbon? What is the word carbon? What is the word carbon, right? It actually means to come close. Because it's coming to tell you that when you bring a sacrifice, what you're really doing is coming close to Hashem. Adam kasher yiskarev le'elokus. Adam ki yakriv. So in other words, you could read it in English, you could translate it as a man when he sacrifices, or you could literally read the words as a man when he comes close to God. Hine mikem hu carbon l'Hashem, and that's why the word mikem is suddenly sitting at the end of it, because it's telling you the instructions on how to come close to Hashem. Mikem, from you. Mikem ubachem toloi hadavar lios carbon l'Hashem. From you and in you, it depends. The whole matter depends to bring a carbon to Hashem. In other words, lihainu lios karov el Hashem. If you want to come close to Hashem, it all depends on you. Is a groundbreaking way of understanding this verse and life, right? Because most people would think that how do I become close to Hashem? Well, I'm going to come to yeshiva. I'm going to learn how to pray. I'm going to learn how to read. I'm going to learn what everybody does and the time to show up for everything. And I'm going to follow a formula, basically. And what he's trying to say is, that's nice. You can follow a formula. You can go to school. But that's not necessarily called a carbon l'Hashem. A carbon l'Hashem is mikem You. Whatever, I need you. Right? Wherever you are and whatever's going on with yourself, that's what has to come close. So in other words, it's extremely personalized. Right? If you can't judge your level of closeness on the person sitting next to you because he's in his own world with his own struggles and his own challenges. And even though you're both sitting down at a Gemara, it's two different universes sitting down at that Gemara. And in order to actually consider it to be like an act of God, one guy maybe he grew up with it. It's old hat for him, and for him to be sitting there is basically not such a. First of all, he loves learning, right? It's not such a difficulty for him, so that's not called him necessarily coming close to God. He's not bringing himself close to mikem per se, because there's aspects of him which are not being challenged in that moment. He's not having to, so to speak, make a sacrifice, right? Each person in their own world has the keys to knowing exactly when you're actually giving yourself. It's really coming from you. And this is sort of what's really going on in these sacrifices, that it's coming to tell you that you have to offer yourself, right? And so even when we were offering the animal, it's said in such a way, Adam ki yakriv mikem, that it has to be from you. And I guess in the old days, there was also an aspect of that just physically. They would have to bring their own animals. It was like their own money, right? And Mistama, it was more of a significant dent in the person. In any case, so he says, Hainu lios karav elavaya. If you want to be close to Hashem, it has to come from you. The yidua the karbanos hem inyan kiru v'kochos v'chushim. What are karbanos really? It's bringing forth your powers and your chushim, your talents, essentially. Uba bezel levaer, and he comes here to explain the kasher balis karav elukus. When you want to come close to God, who miken, it has to be from you. There's no other way. You can't just, dial in the rules of the sacrifice and say, what do you mean? I gave Basi the cow, I'm good to go. If it wasn't really something that was from you in a very deep, meaningful way, that only God and you know what your sort of secret closeness to Hashem would require, it's not called a sacrifice. That's why it's said in that way, to come from you. So it's essentially what you're offering. It all depends on you. And therefore, Al Yomer Adam Eich Iskar Elukus. A person therefore also should never say, how can I get close to God? Right? In other words, I'm not ubifrat, particularly kasher yodea mahuso atzmi. He knows his true self, right? He knows where he came from. He knows what his private matters are and what he's doing with himself, and his relationships and where they're holding. He knows that he knows where he stands in life. As maybe it's not such a pretty picture. So he could say to himself, like, oh, when I look at the guy sitting next to me, and he's learning his Gemara, he's a good person, he can get close to God. How can I get close to God? Is this really realistic for me? He knows that he's lowly and dirty. In many bad things. And therefore he's as far away as you can be from godliness. And he'll ask himself, how can I get close? In other words, what, I'm going to bring a carbon, everything's going to be okay? It's like the classic, I'll just pay off the rabbi, and it's just like, it's a game. I'm pretending, he's pretending, no one knows my secret life. And here I'm just bringing my carbon, and I'm forgiven for my sins. Right? So that's what he's thinking. That's what a carbon is. He's thinking this religion is not really going to cover me. And therefore, that's not what a carbon is. Al zehu omer mikem. That's why it says if you want to bring a sacrifice, you have to bring it from yourself. Bachem hadavar tuli. It all depends on you. Shekol echad ve'echad miYisrael yechol lomer. That every single Jew can say, Masai yegiu Masai lemaisei avosei Avram Yitzchak Yaakov. Every Jew can say, when will my deeds reach the deeds of my forefathers Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov? Ve'ein b'zeh hagbalus klal. And there really is no limitation on that. You could go all the way. Ve'ein shum davar monei ma'akev chalil. And there's nothing really standing in your way. La'los lagia liskarev lelukus. To go up and reach this level of closeness to Hashem. And so you're saying, wait, did you make it worse or better? All you're telling me now is that I could reach the level of my forefathers, but I'm not. The point he's making is every little time you take one little step towards Hashem, right? That's considered a carbon. And therefore you should never say, how can I reach how am I really fit to serve Hashem? Because I'm not right now presently in a place where I'm fit to serve God. Quite the contrary. Exactly where you are, right? Coming one step closer is called a carbon, because it doesn't come from some generalized formula. It comes literally from exactly where you are. So if you're working on this particular issue, you can't say, I'm so far from Hashem, I'll never get there. On the contrary, right where you are, if you go one step forward, that's called a carbon. And dafka, that's called a carbon. If you start doing some fanciful thing where you pretend to sort of offer some formulaic way of approaching Hashem and think that you're accomplishing something there, you're not. That's not a carbon. A carbon means coming closer. And the closeness comes from exactly where you are. So you're always able to come close to Hashem, no matter how far away you are, because exactly where you are, you can make one step further. And that is literally what it says. Adam ki yakriv, a person, when he wants to get close, and you might say, how can I do it? How can I do it? I'm not. No, mikem, from where you are right now, take one step, and you just offer the sacrifice to Hashem, according to the law. Ve'ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu ba b'terunya im briosav. And the idea is Hashem does not come, ba b'terunya im briosav means that Hashem does not ask more of, briosav means his creation, right? He doesn't come burdensome on the creation, asking more than what a person can do, right? So Hashem will there's the whole idea that we say every day, that, Hashem, Asher Yatzar Sa'adam, right? Hashem formed man, nekavim, chalim, with all these little holes and crevices inside of our body, that afilu echad mehem, even if one of them was like not perfect, the whole system would break down. We don't even realize how precious like the tiny little operations of our bodies are. If like the one thing would go wrong, it just wouldn't be alive anymore. Like everything is just like it's being sustained by like a miracle every second. And the idea is the same thing is true not only inside your body but outside your body. Like what you can handle, your mind, your Yetzer Hara, what's being asked of you, right? The job that's being placed on you. It's the mitzvahs from Sinai, right? It's all like mamish tailor-made to the point of chalim, nekavim, in such a way that it's impossible for you to be required to do something more than what you could do, because the same creator who set up the perfectness of the system, he's the one asking you. He's never going to ask you to do something that you can't do. He's not going to bring betarunya in briosif. He's not going to come asking unreasonable requests on his creation. So if he's asking you to bring a carbon to come closer, then whatever Yetzer Hara that you have to know it's not unpassable, right? He gave you that exact Yetzer Hara and that exact challenge because that's your mikem. That's where you have to come from, exactly where you're standing, and come close. And he would never ask you to do something you couldn't do. And therefore, whatever challenge you have to be 100% certain that it is possible to overcome it, because that's what he says. You can even reach the level of your forefathers, right? Nothing's actually standing in your way. If it was, Hashem wouldn't give you such a commandment. And Hashem reveals himself to each and every single person in accordance with that person's abilities and his powers. Get the east of Midrash Rabbah, as the Midrash says, that when I am requesting something from you, I'm not asking in accordance with what I can handle, with my strength. I'm asking in accordance with your strength. So you can't really say, Hashem, like, okay, you're God. You can demand such a thing from me because, like, you think that's normal. But I'm sorry, I'm down here in this little world. I have a little human body. I can't pull that off. No, he created you. He formed you. He even made you. He knows exactly what you can and can't do. And when he requires something of you, he's requiring it in accordance with your limitations, not his infinite abilities. The fikoach shel kol echad ve'echad, according to the abilities of each and every one. And therefore, it's 100% within the power of every single person to go higher and higher infinitely. Like every day is just like a challenge that you can conquer before you, not only every day, but every moment, right? You wouldn't be in a situation where you were being asked more than you could do. But okay, it's a sacrifice, right? You have to come close. It's not easy to come close. You have to bring yourself to the table, but you can do it. Vezeu Adam ki yakriv, and that's what it means. Adam ki yakriv, when a person wants to come close. That if a person wants to get closer to God, it's from you, from right where you are. Right? It all depends on you. There's no formula. It's in your hands. Ainu mikem carbon lashem. And that's what it says, right? Adam ki yakriv mikem carbon lashem. It's from you to get close to Hashem. So you could read those 3 words in the verse, and it's like a standalone sentence. It's from you to get close to Hashem. To mikem takrivu as carbon lashem. The Eina Kavana Raka carbon shel behema vilvad. And when the verse says this, it's not speaking merely about the animal sacrifice alone. Ki mikem mamish. It's literally talking about from you yourself. And so why does the verse go on to say mina behema, mina baka, mina tzon? It goes on to say, if we've already just like switched this into some Hasidic goggles, that this is now talking about some spiritual avoda for each and every Jew, and it's not just talking about the rules of an animal, then why does it right away say? In other words, let's stay consistent. It says Adam ki yakriv mikem carbon lashem. Fine, we've understood that differently. What do I do with the words when it says mina behema, mina baka, mina tzon? Right? It's from the animals. It says specifically from the animals, from the flock, from the sheep. So he says v'hu mina behema. That's talking about the behema shebelibo shel Adam, shu nefesh bahamis. Right? It's talking about the animal inside the heart of man. So when it's right away after that comes and says, you have to come from you, it's not talking about coming from you, from your godly soul. Right? Let's be clear. Your godly soul is already close to Hashem. When it's talking about you have to come close to Hashem, and it has to become mikem, then the next thing it says, mina behema. Right? It has to come from the animal aspect of you. Right? Which is your nefesh bahamis. Mina bakar, mina tzon. Why does it say from the cattle or from the flock? Those are the different types of nefesh bahamas that people have. It's just like you could bring a different carbon based on your financial status or your status of sin, etc. So too, each one has a different animal. And it's telling you that it's not a formulaic in the sense that you could just bring somebody else's animal. You have to bring your unique problem with your animal, nefesh bahamas. Hem hema prati medregos sheyeshna b'nefesh bahamas. And these are when it goes through and says the flock, the cattle, etc., it's referring to the different types of nefesh bahamas that a person could have. As is known, this is also brought in the Kuntrus Atafila from the Rebbe Rashab. This conversation, he says that it's known not everybody has the same manner of refining the world. Each one has like sort of a different qualities and powers when it comes to stepping forward to do the refinement. The yeshno nefesh bahamas shelo hu shur nagach ubal midos gaso biyoser. Some people, their animal soul is a goring ox, which means that he comes in like a body of like a big giant animal who has midos gasos biyoser. Right? In other words, he comes into an unrefined body. And he's got like major anger problems or major traumas, right? Or major, like in other words, he's dealing with a heavy package, this poor guy, right? And he's called an ox. So this guy has to bring an ox, right? For his carbon. Because if he tries to bring a sheep, sorry, that's not the carbon for you. In other words, you have to bring from yourself. So again, so you can't like look over your shoulder and copy the other guy's test and be like, well, I think I'll serve like him. It doesn't work like that. It's a completely personalized situation. Otherwise, you're not called getting close to Hashem. You can't really fake this. V'yeshu tzon. Some people are a little shepsala. They're a sheep, which is a behema daka. It's a much more refined animal. They grew up in a frum home, and they had mamash righteous parents. Right? They also have nefesh bahamas, but it's a little sheep, which means it has. By the way, it doesn't mean it's easier per se. It's just a different avoda. Because the sheep has different negative tendencies, let's say, than the ox. For example, the ox, not every ox is necessarily like such a follower. You know what I mean? If a sheep, one of the problems with a sheep is that they just do whatever the other sheep are doing, right? So you might have more refined midos, it's true, but you might have a whole business about like finding your own identity and personality. You have to work on your sheep. Even though the sheep is also part of what's called an animal, but it's bedakos al kopanim, but it's a lesser load, right? Lesser intensity of negativity in the midos, or not necessarily negativity, but of grossness. And as the Rebbe Rashav explains at great length in a kuntris called the Kuntris HaTefillah. And that's why it says that you shall offer your sacrifices. Right? So in other words, let's just put a period before we move on. This is what it means, that you shall offer your sacrifice. In other words, your unique one. You're not going to offer the same one as the other guy. So moving on to the next concept here. Yeah, Daniel.
Is there a list of specific animals
Of course.
within Chabad Torah which specifically talks about those aspects that I can look at later down the line?
Yes, there is. It's called Kuntris HaTefillah. We have it here from the Rebbe Rashab. He goes a little bit more into detail than here. But again, the aspects are the animals that you can offer on the altar. In other words, those, in general, the Jewish people are compared to kosher animals. Even though we have blessings, actually, in this week's Parsha, right, where we're compared to non-kosher animals in terms of like sort of our strength and so forth. Yud is a lion and Dan is a snake, and there's different, non-kosher animals that we are compared to in terms of the mightiness of them. Yeah. But in terms of like the difference between sort of Jews and non-Jews in terms of what we're reading in Tanya, there is a different natural tendencies within a non-Jew versus a Jew. So it says, for example, that there's certain shindaladim, demons, that come to a person to try and tempt them, and the demons that tempt a Jew only tempt him to do things that are actually permissible according to the Torah, but just like overdoing it. Like, for example, they'll make you eat too much or sleep in, right? But if you are tempted suddenly to like eat pork, it's not actually a natural phenomenon inside of a Jew. You're like borrowing the shindaladim, the demons of the non-Jews, who they have tendencies to eat non-kosher food. We don't have a natural tendency to eat non-kosher food. It's kind of a weird thing, right? We don't have, because again, Hashem lo ba b'terunya al briosov. He doesn't come asking us to do more than we can handle. If he would give us a natural tendency to do isurim, mamash, things that are prohibited according to Torah, it would be much, much harder for us to live lives as a Jew. So we don't even have that natural interest. So, and therefore the Jewish people are compared to kosher animals, and the non-Jewish people are compared to non-kosher animals who are basically more violent in nature, right? Stronger, right, in a sense. And therefore sometimes we are compared to non-kosher animals when we're trying to talk about their good qualities. But in general, in terms of like their jungle, attitude towards life, like the non-kosher animals are essentially, they're not, that's not what you're bringing for an offering. That's what I was trying to point out. Those offerings, those animals that you're allowed to bring on the altar, those are the kosher animals, and those are the ones that you should look inside yourself and find out like which one of them you are.
It's only 4?
Yeah. I mean, there's 4 basic ones, yeah.
So basically, we're just talking about in the realm of specifically kosher animals. Meaning this whole thing.
I mean, look, if God forbid you were like, you grew up, look, some Jews do have a strong desire for eating pork because they grew up with, I'm just speaking personally about my nanny from South Carolina, and she used to cook it up good there. You know what I'm saying? Like you have to basically realize what's coming from you and what you like imported from the culture. So you might have to at first sort of like shed your non-Jewish tendencies, but they're really not your natural tendencies. So it should be more or less, I don't know. You have to, each person has to deal with their own package. Once you've like sort of drawn to yourself these goyish demons, then it's a process to get rid of them. But the point is, it's not really you. It's not your problem. It should be easier to get rid of those major things. Yeah.
Tanya's covering a section now, like chapter 9, chapter 10, where it's like talking about how, like we by the process of refining ourselves and and our characteristics, our meters, and all sort of stuff. Like we align with the will of Hashem, but like it's reworking the systems that are in place. Like you have pleasure, don't just have pleasure just for the body, have pleasure for for serving Hashem. So like eat joyfully on Shabbos, or like you use it to that end. So you're saying now that we have completely like external influences that came from other places.
You
that we
could.
picked up,
You could. You don't have to. God forbid. You don't want them. But it could happen that if you suddenly find yourself having a desire to, do something which is usher according to the Torah, you didn't get born with that. Let's put it like that. You learned that from somewhere. It's not natural for you. You're a sheep. You're an ox. You're not like a predatory animal in your nature.
It's interesting, honestly, how like seeped we are in non-Jewish, how like assimilated like Jewish culture has become. Like so,
Right.
It's like so easy. Like our music we listen to, and TV shows and everything. Like I
Right.
feel like we've all been so deeply ingrained, so it's like it makes sense.
Right. We borrow it from the culture around us. But yeah, in terms of, what you're saying, the first thing you said was just that we're supposed to realign our desires for God. That's exactly what a carbon is. You take an animal in the field, right? And you basically, instead of just letting it do its animalistic thing, you use it in the service of Hashem. You put it on the altar, you bring it to the Kohanim, you sing, and the Levim play instruments around it, right? And like you turn this like natural world into some kind of divine service. So that's the whole concept of birurim. Sorry, we did that line already. No, did we?
No.
Yeah, we did that. Yeah, so we did that. So we're saying that right after that period there, the carbon agashmi, right? Hine carbon agashmi, hu shemevim behema gashmi sal gavi mizbeach. When it comes to the physical animal, is that you bring the physical animal onto the altar via eish shelamayla. And something took place, which was certainly in the first temple, that a fire from heaven would come down to consume it. We actually have like sort of a picture of that from Yom Tov up there. K'de'isa b'yuma, as it says in the Gemara, revutza ka'ari, right? That there was a, well, actually, I guess there's two actually interpretations of what it means, the fire from heaven. One was that there was a fire from heaven that originally came down and lit the menorah, that then lit the altar, lit the fire on the altar, and we preserved that fire forever as like the fire that we're going to use to make sacrifices. There's another definition that every time they would offer a sacrifice, there was like a fire that came down from heaven in the form of a lion that consumed the sacrifice. Different fires from heaven, but a similar concept. So here you're talking about the first one. It says that revutza ka'ari, there was like crouching like a lion, right? That there was a gacheles shenaflu min hashamayim. There was a coal that fell from heaven in the days of Shlomo, and it settled in Mizbeach, and that was sort of like the fire from heaven, right? A fire from above that came down, and they would use that to light the wood every day. But in the Zohar it says Arya da Achel Kurbanin is a different fire lion, and that's what we were talking about. The second opinion is that from the Zohar that the lion in the form of fire, or the fire in the form of lion, would come down and actually eat the sacrifices every day. So in other words, what we're saying is, either way you look at it, there's something called a fire from heaven. There's the animal from below, and there's the heavenly fire from above. So if that's true about the sacrifice in the temple, every one of these things has to have a correlation in our own private avoda. Adam ki yakriv mikem, when you're going to bring it from yourself. We now know what the animal part is. That's your unique nefesh Bahamas, exactly where you're holding, and like the blow by blow reality of your life. Wherever you are, you need to move the needle one step further. That's called coming close. But what about this fire from heaven? So too it is in the spiritual service of man. There's also called the fire from heaven in our own sacrifice. And what is this? This is the burning love of God that's in our divine soul. Right? So you already are bearing inside of you a perfect being, a piece of God, mamish, and it desires God and it's burning for God all the time. As it says in Shir Hashirim, that it's a flame of burning love of Yudke, right? It's a godly flame of love. The East of Midrash Rabbah, and it says in the Midrash, and it's brought in Yalkut, Ke'esh Shalamayla, and it refers to that burning love inside of a Jew as a fire from heaven. So we see that that's the fire from heaven correlation in the temple sacrifices. And when it comes to this fire from heaven, since it's called a heavenly fire, then it cannot be extinguished by water, right? Which means that you have this Baruch Hashem, this perpetual Eish Tamid, right? This fire inside of you, which really the animalistic reality that you're living, even if you have non-Jewish goyim, shindaladim, right? Demons like pursuing you. No matter what place you fall into in this life, you always have inside of you preserved a burning desire for Hashem, which cannot be extinguished by, so to speak, water. In other places, it says this water represents the flood waters of a Parnasa or a Gullus, whatever it is. It's never extinguished, right?
But like why? Like meaning,
it doesn't mean that it has to always be.
If you were to take water and then you were to put it on
not a fire from heaven.
Fire.
Yeah, but we're talking about an Eish Shalamayla. This is a type of fire that water does not extinguish. It's a special fire, right? And the idea is that it's something that is actually realistically found inside of you, right? No one can actually make your divine yearning go away. All it can do is it can be concealed, but it never gets extinguished. You never lose your nefesh elokis so long as you're alive. That in the nature of the divine soul, right? Just like you have a natural animalistic tendencies, whether you're a sheep, whether you're an ox, you have those natures of doing those things. You also have a godly soul which has its own nature. It's inside of you. Now, the truth is, you might have been allowed the nature of the animal to totally run the body. And so this nature that you have inside of your godly soul of like loving God could be in exile, which is the whole notion of like the Jew in exile in the world is a metaphor for the Jew in exile inside of ourselves. Because there's like this Jew who's like burning to serve God and he's got a temple and ready to go, but you don't let him out. He's controlled by the goy who's keeping him under wraps. Doesn't mean the Jew dies in exile. I still see there's Jews throughout all exile. You can't kill us. Even though theoretically water should have extinguished us a long time ago, we're a miraculous fire from heaven that doesn't go out, but it can be that it's not showing, right? So you have this thing inside of you. And it's like a heavenly fire that water cannot extinguish. And what is the water that might extinguish it, if it could? They're mayim rabim. This is like what we call in Hasidic language the mighty waters. B'riboy tardos tirdos, b'taros parnaso bilbulim shonim, b'tardos shonos amabalbim b'torah ba'avoda. These are called the burdensome bothers of making a parnasa and different things that will confound you when it comes to your attempt to try to learn Torah and do avoda. Right, you're going to just get swept up with your cell phone. Let's just call it a day, right? Because you got all the confounding things are right there in your pocket. Despite the fact that it's all coming against you, right? This burning love, rivers cannot wash it away. Because that burning love of God in your godly soul is like an example of Eish Shalamayla. It's heavenly fire, not a natural fire which can be extinguished. So it cannot be extinguished by water. And this is why you need to offer your animal soul. It's a dual system over here, right? If you want the godly burning love, which is always there, to come out, there's a way to get it to come out. You bring an animal on the altar and it comes out. What's the idea of bringing an animal of the altar? Taking your animal, sheep or ox, and moving the needle a little bit, mikem, right from where you are. No one's asking you to have some formulaic way of serving Hashem, which is not very personal to you, and you just move yourself closer to Hashem a little bit. And what do you discover suddenly? If your offering is accepted, right? Which means it was not formulaic. It was coming from you. Actually, made a change in yourself, and you put your animal where it belonged. There will be a response, which is that suddenly your heavenly fire will show up to the party, and you'll experience your godly soul's love, right? This is how you find it. Shagam hu yelo avalalukus, meaning to say, and this is a beautiful little point, which is not only that your animal soul sort of gets out of the way and allows your godly soul to surface. No, your animal soul is on fire with the fire from heaven, right? Practically speaking, what happens? It's the animal itself that gets caught in the flames, which means that even your sheep. This is the idea of eating on Shabbos. This is called like real transformation. Subjugation is putting your animal on the altar in the begin with. That's not fun. But transformation is kind of fun because you've now taken the animal and it is loving Hashem too because it's on fire with the godly fire from heaven. And that's what it says. You shall love Hashem with all your heart. Remember we talked about this yesterday. And the sages say, why are there two vases in the word levav? What is the word levav? It should say b'chol libecha, right? But the fact that it has two vases in that word, right away Rashi has to come in and sweep it and tell us this is strange. What's the pshat? He says, shnei yitzarecha. It's called loving Hashem with both of your yitzers. How do you love Hashem with your yetzer hara? Right? So we spoke about it yesterday a little bit. The video got cut off, but we were talking about the notion that there's two ways of loving Hashem with your yetzer hara. One is hiskafia, one is hispcha. Hiskafia is loving your Hashem with your yetzer hara, not by the yetzer hara loving Hashem, but by sacrificing your yetzer hara. You're using your yetzer hara in the service of Hashem. So by getting your ox on the altar to begin with, which is not in necessarily the best interest of the ox, and the ox is not necessarily looking to run over there, you're putting him on there, you're bringing yourself close. That's an act of iskafia. So you're using your yetzer hara, so to speak, as the object with which you serve Hashem, but it's still not loving Hashem itself. But once it gets caught on fire, you can actually serve Hashem with your yetzer hara. That the same passions and drives and appetites that you previously allowed to sink into the negativity, they're now caught fire by the divine fire of your godly soul, and you're using your animalistic powers, which are actually strong and mighty, in the service of God, and they too are loving God. So like your philosophical mind, right? Most of the people who wind up at a Chabad table over here, you anyway were like smart, right? You were looking at things like deeply, right? Because then you want to find like the deepest parts of the Torah. So like all the philosophy and the different religions that you went and investigated and all these, like all of a sudden you find you can use that part of your mind in full engrossment in the philosophy of Torah. It's basically just transforming the passions that you had in these other areas of study, lahavdil, into Torah. Anyway, this is called catching fire on the animal soul. That even the animal soul has a love for God, because it's not impossible. And this is like the beauty really of Chabad Hasidus. Like straight up, if there's one thing that it does, and it does many things, it's really that it explains to your animal soul the significance of God. Like that little you just made a second ago, like, wow, that's not really necessarily coming from your godly soul, right? It's like if someone explained to you like a piece of philosophy, lahavdil, in another world, it's just interesting. It's like it brings something together where you can comprehend and grasp, which is a human endeavor, right? In other words, theoretically, a goy as well would be taken by this information because it's just deep and satisfying to the brain. So again, this is something that we didn't have the ability to do before in the mysticism of Judaism. If you wanted to associate yourself with the mysticism, there was no understanding of it. There was only a belief in it, right? And sort of like maybe some kind of mystical practice to align yourself with it. But from the idea that there's something called Chabad, this is what it is. It enables the animalistic mind to all of a sudden be enjoying, like a piece of steak, the mysticism and unknown things of the Torah. And so your animal soul too can be in love with Hashem at this level. So this is called the Karban LaHashem. All right, we're running out of time. I see the crowd's getting restless, so we'll hold here.
Oh, Mensch, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
Oh.